The noumenon doesn't exist. That's the whole point. And Kant spent 40 pages making sure you couldn't dismiss it. What he actually says is stranger than the way it usually gets taught. Most people walk away from an intro philosophy course thinking the phenomenon noumenon split means something like, there's the world as it appears to us, and then there's the real world behind it, and we can't quite get to the real one. A wall we press against. The noumenon as the thing in itself, glowing darkly on the other side of our senses. Knowable in principle, just not by creatures like us. That reading is wrong in a way that matters, and Kant says so explicitly, and then watches you make the mistake anyway. The concept of a noumenon is, in his own words, a merely limiting concept, the function of which is to curb the pretensions of sensibility, not a description of another realm, not a placeholder for God's knowledge. A fence that doesn't mark where something is, but where your categories stop working, which turns out to be the same thing. To understand why that's not a trivial distinction, you need to see what Kant is actually doing with the categories: causality, substance, existence, necessity, the whole set. Because the categories are the engine of the whole problem. They're the pure concepts of understanding, the forms of thought through which raw sensory data gets organized into anything recognizable as a world. This caused that. This substance persists through time. This state of affairs is possible. What Kant noticed, working through it with the patience of a man who knew he'd gotten something right, even before he fully knew what, is that these categories look like they should apply to anything at all, because they don't seem to depend on the senses in the way that sensory impressions themselves do. Causality doesn't smell like anything. Substance has no color. So the temptation, the illusion he calls it, an illusion from which it is difficult to escape, is to assume the categories can therefore range freely over everything, including things that never touch our senses at all. They can't. And the proof is almost embarrassingly direct once you see it. A concept needs two things to do any real work: its logical form and an object to which it can be applied. The logical form is the easy part. You can think the structure of causality without thinking of any particular caused thing. But the object can only be given in intuition, and the only intuition we have access to is sensible intuition, the deliverances of perception organized through space and time. Strip the sensory content away, and the category becomes what Kant calls a mere play of imagination or of understanding. It's still grammatically coherent. It just doesn't mean anything. He demonstrates this with a surgical precision that must have annoyed every rationalist philosopher who came after him. Take substance, strip out permanence through time, which is the empirical sensory condition under which we apply the category, and what remains? Nothing save only the logical representation of a subject. You can think it. You can't use it. You can't determine any object for it. Can't draw any inference from it. Can't tell whether it signifies anything at all. Kant says this with unusual directness. Without the conditions of sensibility, a concept loses not just its application, but all meaning, that is, relation to the object. Or take causality without the time sequence of one state following another in conformity with a rule. You're left with something like one thing that implies another thing, which gives you no means of distinguishing cause from effect, no grip on the world, no purchase anywhere. The pure category, severed from sensibility, doesn't just fail to describe things, it fails to be about anything. This is what empirical employment versus transcendental employment means. Not a distinction between humble and ambitious inquiry, a distinction between functional and empty. The empirical employment of a concept applies it to objects of a possible experience, where intuition can come in to verify and fill it. The transcendental employment applies it to things in general and in themselves, without regard to how they'd ever be given to us. And at that point, you're using words to arrange other words in patterns that feel like knowledge and aren't. So the noumenon enters not as a discovery, but as a warning label. Call something a phenomenon, an appearance, a sensible entity, something given to us through intuition, and you've implicitly distinguished it from what it might be in itself, independent of the conditions under which we cognize it. That distinction is legitimate. It does real logical work. It keeps you from sliding from this is how the rock appears to me into this is what the rock ultimately is, which is a slide Kant thought most of his predecessors had made without noticing. The noumenon in this negative sense is just the same thing, considered without reference to our mode of intuiting it, not a different object, not a secret object, the very same object, but with the question, what is it? Stripped of everything sensory, asked about it. And the answer to that question is that the question can't be answered because we have no access to anything that isn't already filtered through our sensory and cognitive apparatus. The positive sense of the noumenon is different, and Kant is careful about it in a way that most summaries collapse. The noumenon, in the positive sense, would be an object of a non-sensal intuition, something grasped directly by pure intellect, without the mediation of space, time, or empirical sensation that would require a mode of intuition Kant calls intellectual intuition, and he's categorical. Such a type of intuition, intellectual intuition, forms no part whatsoever of our faculty of knowledge. We don't have it. We can barely conceive what it would mean to have it. So the positive noumenon isn't just unknown. It's a concept without a possible referent for creatures constituted like us. The noumenon in the negative sense is a boundary marker. The noumenon in the positive sense is what lies beyond the boundary. And we've no business pretending we know what's there. What the understanding gains from all this, Kant says, is a negative extension, an expansion not in what it can know, but in what it can't be tricked into claiming to know. It limits sensibility by saying, Whatever appears to us isn't exhaustive of reality, and it limits itself by saying, but what lies beyond appearance is, for us, an unknown something. The noumenon serves as what he calls a merely limiting concept, not describing a domain, but marking where the domain ends, like an empty space for the limitation of empirical principles. That phrase, like an empty space, is Kant being more honest than he needed to be. An empty space isn't nothing. A room with nothing in it is still a room, and its walls still tell you something about where you are. The noumenon doesn't tell you what things are in themselves. It tells you that your categories, even your most basic ones, don't reach that far. Proud ontology, as Kant calls it, the discipline that claimed to deliver synthetic a priori knowledge of things in general, has to give way to the modest title of a mere analytic of pure understanding. The island of truth is real. The surrounding ocean is too. You just can't sail it. The complication is this. The whole argument rests on a distinction between things as they appear to us and things as they are in themselves, that the argument itself shows we can't cash out. Kant needs the thing in itself to explain why appearances are appearances of something. Without it, phenomena collapse into mere subjective states with no object at all, and knowledge becomes a conversation the mind has with itself. But the moment he invokes the thing in itself, he's gesturing at precisely what he's just shown cannot be given to us, cannot be intuited, cannot be reached by any category we possess. The noumenon is both indispensable and empty. He knows this, which is why he calls it problematic, a technical term in his system for a concept that contains no contradiction, connects to our other knowledge in useful ways, but cannot have its objective reality established in any possible experience. Problematic, coherent, necessary, and permanently beyond verification. The limiting concept limits him too. He has to think something he cannot know, and the structure of his own argument is what makes that unavoidable. The moon looks larger at the horizon than it does overhead, and an astronomer who has spent 30 years mapping the sky still sees it that way, still involuntarily gets it wrong, because the illusion doesn't come from ignorance. It comes from the structure of human perception itself. Kant uses exactly this example to introduce what he considers the deepest problem in the whole of philosophy. That reason, the very faculty by which we correct illusions, is the source of an illusion it can never correct. This is the nerve of the Transcendental Dialectic, and it's worth taking seriously before moving anywhere else. Kant distinguishes three kinds of error. Logical illusion is a bad argument. Catch the mistake. Fix the argument, the error disappears. Empirical illusion is a misread of perceptual data. Learn that the moon's angular size doesn't actually change. Adjust your judgment, move on. But transcendental illusion, as Kant characterizes it, is different in kind. It does not cease even after it has been detected and its invalidity clearly revealed by transcendental criticism. You can know that you're caught in it. you can write a whole critique about it. The illusion will not cease to play tricks with reason and continually entrap it into momentary aberrations ever and again, calling for correction. Not once, ever and again. What's the illusion? It's this. We take the subjective necessity of a connection among our concepts, the way our reason must operate to function at all, and we read it as an objective necessity in the world. We mistake the grammar of thought for the structure of reality. The astronomer sees the large moon. We see an uncaused cause, an immortal soul, a world with a beginning in time, and we can't stop seeing them even after we know their projections. To understand why this is inevitable and not merely a mistake, you need the distinction Kant draws between the understanding and reason, two faculties that most people collapse into one without noticing the problem. Understanding, in Kant's accounting, is the faculty of rules. It takes sensory intuitions and organizes them under categories, making experience coherent, making it possible to say that this event caused that one, that this object has that property. Understanding is always, in his word, immanent. Its employment is always limited to what can in principle be given in experience. It doesn't float free. It's tethered. Reason is different. Reason is the faculty of principles. Its job is not to organize intuitions, but to take the deliverances of understanding, already organized, already rule-governed, and push them toward systematic unity, toward completeness. It does this by asking, always, for the condition of the condition. Given any conditioned fact, what's the condition that makes it possible? And then, what's the condition of that condition? Reason won't stop there. It can't stop there. The principle peculiar to reason in general, as Kant frames it, is to find for the conditioned knowledge obtained through the understanding the unconditioned, whereby its unity is brought to completion. It's not looking for the next link in a chain. It's looking for the end of the chain, and not just the end, but the ground, the whole series collected at once into a totality that explains itself. The fatal move comes next. Reason operates logically as a kind of maxim. Assume the conditions, push toward their ground, treat the series as if it were complete. That's fine as a regulative procedure, a way of directing inquiry. But pure reason silently promotes this maxim to a constitutive claim. If the conditioned is given, then the whole series of conditions, subordinated to one another, a series which is therefore itself unconditioned, is likewise given. Not merely keep looking, but it's there. The completeness of the series is assumed to be a feature of the object, not a requirement of reason's own procedure. This is where the mechanism of transcendental illusion locks in, not in carelessness, not in sophistry, but in the very structure of what reason is. And it's here that Kant pauses to rescue Plato from his critics, in a move that reveals what he actually thinks is at stake. Plato's ideas, not the color red, not any image, but concepts of what things would be in their perfection, coinciding with no sensory instance, These struck most of Kant's contemporaries as mystical fantasy, the Republic as the daydream of an idle thinker. Kant disagrees, and his disagreement is precise. Plato very well realized that our faculty of knowledge feels a much higher need than merely to spell out appearances according to a synthetic unity in order to be able to read them as experience. The understanding handles appearances. Reason reaches for something else, for archetypes that appearances can only approximate, never exhaust. An idea, for both Plato and Kant, is not a fiction of the brain. It's a concept that reason cannot help generating, that no given empirical object can ever coincide with, and that is by no means, therefore, without reality or necessity. This is the moment where Kant formally defines what he means. I understand by idea a necessary concept of reason to which no corresponding object can be given in sense experience. Necessary, not optional, not a mistake, not a regrettable habit, imposed on reason by reason itself, not borrowed from experience, not invented. An idea in this technical sense is precisely a concept formed from pure concepts of understanding that transcend the possibility of experience. Not a red color, not a mathematical triangle, the soul, the world as a totality, God. These are the three destinations that reason arrives at, not because someone told it to go there, but because the logical forms of inference followed all the way out, deposited there. The argument for why those three and not some other three is worth following because it's weirder than it first appears. Reason operates through syllogisms, and there are three fundamental forms of syllogistic relation: categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. Each form generates, when applied to the business of seeking the unconditioned, exactly one idea. The categorical syllogism, reasoning about subjects and predicates, when pushed toward the unconditioned subject of all inner states, yields the idea of the soul, the absolute unconditioned unity of the thinking subject. The hypothetical syllogism, reasoning about conditions and consequences, when pushed toward the unconditioned ground of all appearances, yields the idea of the world, the cosmos, as a complete, self-contained series. The disjunctive syllogism, reasoning about the division of all possibilities, when pushed toward the thing that grounds the entire division, yields the idea of God, the being of all beings, the original condition of the possibility of everything that can be thought. The advance from the knowledge of oneself, the soul, to the knowledge of the world, and by means of this, to the original being, is so natural that it seems to resemble the logical advance of reason from premises to conclusion. Soul, world, God. The three pillars of traditional metaphysics and theology. Kant's claim is that reason arrives at these not by insight, not by revelation, not by argument that deserves to stand, but because the forms of its own inference, when run off the rails of possible experience, generate these three and nothing else. They're the shapes that transcendental illusion takes, and they're unavoidable. Now consider what this does to the reader's initial expectation. The expected Kantian verdict here is these three ideas are empty. Stop thinking about them. Get back to science. That reading is available, but Kant won't quite let it stand. These concepts are not arbitrarily invented. They are imposed by the very nature of reason itself. Even as purely speculative objects, even when they can determine no actual thing, they serve as what Kant calls a canon. They guide the understanding search for systematic completeness. They keep inquiry from folding too early into local coherence. They do real work in orienting reason's extended employment. In the practical sphere, ethics, action, freedom, they do more. The idea of perfect justice, the idea of a moral law that allows the freedom of each to coexist with the freedom of all, these are indispensably necessary, precisely because no achieved instance is adequate to them, and the gap between the instance and the idea is where moral striving lives. The cost of this generosity toward reason is one that Kant almost certainly saw, but never quite reckoned with fully. If transcendental illusion is natural and unavoidable, if it belongs to the structure of human reason as such, then the critique itself, the work of exposing this illusion, is produced by the very faculty it diagnoses. Kant's reason, reading out the constraints of reason, is still reason, still subject to the same pull toward the unconditioned, still inclined to treat its own maxims as objective necessities. The transcendental dialectic is reason auditing itself, but an audit conducted by the entity under audit, with no external tribunal to appeal to, is not obviously a neutral procedure. When Kant argues that reason necessarily generates three transcendental ideas, soul, world, God, and that this generation follows from the logical forms of inference, he is reason claiming to have surveyed reason from a vantage point that, by the logic of his own argument, reason can never actually occupy, because the unconditioned standpoint is exactly what's unavailable to us. The illusion will not cease to play tricks with reason, he says, including, presumably, the trick of thinking you've finally seen through it. The I that thinks is not the I that exists. That gap, smaller than a comma, large enough to swallow a science, is what Kant spends the paralogisms trying to pry open. And the resistance you'll feel as you read is not confusion. It's reason fighting back against its own diagnosis. Rational psychology, the tradition Kant is dismantling, professed to be a science built upon the single proposition, I think. The ambition wasn't modest. From this one proposition, without a scrap of empirical evidence, without so much as glancing at a body or a brain, rational psychologists inferred that the soul is substance, that it's simple, that it persists numerically identical through time, that it relates to bodies from a position of ontological independence. Four claims, four paralogisms, each one apparently valid, each one what Kant calls pseudo-rational, not fictitious, not a trick of a dishonest man, but a sophistication not of men, but of pure reason itself, a flaw baked so deep into the structure of reason that Even the wisest of men cannot free himself from the illusion, though he might, after long effort, learn to hold it at arm's length, that framing matters. Kant isn't saying these inferences are stupid. He's saying they're irresistible, which is worse. The machinery of the error is almost architectural in its elegance, which is part of why it's so hard to see. The syllogism of the first paralogism, the one concerning substantiality, runs like this: whatever is the absolute subject of judgments and can never be predicated of something else is a substance. I, as thinking being, am exactly that absolute subject. Therefore, I, as thinking being, am substance. Each step looks clean. The conclusion, the soul is substance, seems almost tautological, and Kant concedes the form is correct. The premises, taken transcendentally, do hold. The problem isn't in the reasoning. The problem is a category swap so subtle it slides past without friction. The category of substance, Kant points out, has in itself no objective meaning save in so far as it rests upon an intuition. Substance, as a concept we can actually use, requires that we first encounter something in experience that's permanent, something that persists while its properties change, something we can point to and track. The E, however, is not that. The I in I think is, as Kant puts it with deliberate bluntness, a bare consciousness which accompanies all concepts, not a concept itself, not an intuition of anything, but the formal condition under which any concept is mine at all, calling it substance because it plays the grammatical role of subject in every judgment is like concluding that the letter X is a number because it can stand in for one. You've taken a logical function and hypostatized it, solidified it into an object without ever having permission to do so. Kant calls this the sophisma figurae dictionanis, an equivocation on the term, where the major premise uses substance in its pure transcendental sense as a bare logical category, and the minor premise smuggles in an empirical application of the same word. You've changed the meaning mid-argument without changing the word, and the conclusion you reach has the texture of knowledge while containing none. The second paralogism, the one Kant labels the Achilles of all dialectical inferences in the pure doctrine of the soul, meaning the one that actually resists even sophisticated attack, concerns simplicity. The argument, a thought can't be distributed across composite parts the way motion can be distributed across the parts of a moving body, because representations distributed among different beings never make up a whole thought, and therefore the thinking subject must be absolutely simple. This is genuinely powerful. If you divide a verse among a dozen people, each holding one word, no one of them grasps the verse. Thought seems to require a single locus. The nervus probandi, the nerve of the proof, is real. Except that Kant's response is also real, and it cuts differently. The simplicity he identifies isn't a simplicity of the soul's nature. It's a simplicity of the representation E. The proposition, I am simple, is not an inference. It's what Kant calls an immediate expression of apperception, the same kind of apparent insight as Descartes' cogito ergo sum, which Kant here dryly notes is really a tautology. The E appears simple because the representation contains nothing determinate. There's no manifold in it. Nothing can be simpler than a concept that is, as Kant says, nothing but a bare consciousness. But, and here's the thing the rational psychologist won't say, the simplicity of the representation of a subject is not eo ipso knowledge of the simplicity of the subject itself. I designate myself by a word so empty, it strips out every quality. The emptiness of the word is not a discovery about the thing. The third paralogism concerning personality, the numerical identity of the soul across time, is the place where Kant introduces what might be the most disturbing image in the whole discussion. An elastic ball that strikes another ball and transmits not just its momentum, but its entire state and the consciousness of that state, which then passes to a third ball and on down the chain, the final ball being conscious of all the previous states as its own, and yet it would not have been one and the same person in all these states. The example is a thought experiment about whether continuous memory could be transmitted through a changing substrate, whether the felt sense of being the same I as yesterday could survive a complete replacement of the underlying substance. Kant's point is that it could, in principle, which means the felt identity proves nothing about the real identity. The identity of the consciousness of myself at different times is therefore only a formal condition of my thoughts and their coherence, and in no way proves the numerical identity of my subject. This is not the same as claiming you're not the same person you were yesterday. It's harder than that. It's claiming we can't know from the inside because the only tool we have for checking is the very thing we're trying to verify. Every judgment I make about the unity of myself has always already made use of its representation. I revolve in what Kant calls a perpetual circle, and the circle doesn't tell me anything about the circumference beyond itself. The fourth paralogism on ideality pivots toward a wider argument about what exists outside us and how we know it. Kant uses it to stage the distinction between transcendental idealism and transcendental realism, with the counterintuitive result that it's the transcendental idealist who ends up as the empirical realist, the one who can actually affirm the reality of the external world. Because for Kant, matter is nothing but a species of representations, and the existence of those representations is something we're immediately conscious of. No inference required. The transcendental realist, who insists on things in themselves existing outside us independently of the senses, ends up with the worst problem. Having insisted the world is out there, he can't close the gap between representation and reality. By the end, Kant's verdict on rational psychology is a verdict of complete nullity dressed up as a partial salvage. The whole of rational psychology as a science surpassing all powers of human reason, proves abortive, and nothing is left for us but to study our soul under the guidance of experience. The discipline that promised a pure science of the self, deduced from the one proposition he think, turns out to have been entirely made up of paralogisms. What remains has considerable negative value, meaning it can stop someone else from making the opposite mistake from dogmatic materialism without itself delivering any positive knowledge. What Kant didn't fully reckon with, and this isn't in the text, but the logic pushes directly toward it, is that negative value is a strange place to leave the subject doing the knowing. The whole Kantian system requires a knowing subject. The categories are the categories of a unified apperception. The conditions of experience are conditions for someone's experience. The very structure of the critique presupposes that the e-think can accompany all my representations, that there is a transcendental unity pulling cognition together. But after the paralogisms, that I has been evacuated of every content that might make it a subject in any substantive sense. It's not substance. It's not simple. Its identity is a formal condition, not a real one. It's, in Kant's own terms, a transcendental subject X, not a concept, not an intuition, known only through what it isn't. The I think that survives the paralogisms is, in Kant's own phrase, completely empty. It's the precondition of all knowing, and it knows nothing about itself. The instrument turns out to be opaque at the point where it grips. The I think is the most load-bearing sentence in the history of philosophy, and it holds up nothing. That sounds like a cheap reversal, but it isn't. Descartes planted the cogito like a cornerstone, and everyone after him assumed the building had gone up. If there's thinking, there must be a thinker. If there's a thinker, it must be a substance. If it's a substance, it must be simple, unified, permanent, distinct from the body, a soul. In other words, with all the metaphysical furniture that word implies. 2,000 years of theology vindicated by a single introspective moment. Kant looked at this and called it a paralogism, not a mistake, exactly. Something more specific and more damning. A syllogism that appears valid and is formally corrupt, where the middle term shifts its meaning between the premises and the conclusion drags you somewhere. The logic never actually went. The syllogism goes like this, and Kant quotes it almost admiringly in its brazenness. That which cannot be thought otherwise than as subject does not exist otherwise than as subject, and is therefore substance. A thinking being, considered merely as such, cannot be thought otherwise than as subject. Therefore it exists also only as subject, that is, as substance. Read it fast and it sounds airtight. Read it slowly and notice what happens to the word subject. In the major premise, we're talking about beings in general, things that might be given in intuition, objects in the world that happen to function as grammatical and metaphysical subjects. In the minor premise, we've quietly switched to the E of self-consciousness, which is subject only in the sense that it's the formal condition of every judgment, the hinge on which thought turns. The conclusion arrives per sophisma figurae dictionis, through an equivocation so smooth it feels like a proof. The soul hasn't been discovered. A word has been used twice. This is what Kant means by paralogism of pure reason. And it's worth pausing on why he bothers giving it such technical dignity instead of just calling it a fallacy. It's because the error isn't accidental. It's what happens when reason takes its own formal conditions for objects of knowledge. When the machinery of thought turns to examine itself and mistakes the shape of the lens for something it's seeing through the lens. The I think, Kant says, accompanies all categories as their vehicle. It's the syntactic frame inside which every judgment happens, every time, without exception. But that ubiquity, that structural necessity, is precisely why it tells you nothing about what you are. A door hinge is present at every opening and closing. That doesn't mean it knows the house. The four paralogisms, substance, simplicity, personality, and the distinction of self from external things are all variations on this same move, and Kant runs through them with what you can only call methodical contempt. That I am always the determining subject of my judgments doesn't mean I am a self-subsistent substance. That determination is a logical role, not an ontological discovery. That the E in every act of thought is one and cannot be resolved into a plurality of subjects is, as Kant flatly says, already contained in the very concept of thought, and is therefore an analytic proposition, meaning it says nothing new about reality, only unpacks what was already in the concept. And then the one that really stings, that I distinguish my existence as a thinking being from all things outside me, is equally analytic, because other things are such as I think to be distinct from myself. I've defined external things as what I'm not, which means the distinction between inner and outer tells me nothing about whether I could exist as a thinking being apart from a body, apart from experience, apart from the whole scaffolding of the empirical world. The specific damage Kant does to Moses Mendelssohn is worth lingering on, because Mendelssohn was not stupid, and his argument was the best version of the position. Mendelssohn had noticed that the usual proof for the soul's immortality, that a simple substance can't be dissolved into parts and therefore can't perish, had a gap. A simple thing might vanish entirely all at once without dissolution. His solution in the Phaedo was to argue that a simple substance can't vanish by degrees either, since it has no magnitude to diminish, and since it can't jump from full existence to non-existence without an intervening process. It's permanent. Kant's response isn't to find a flaw in the logic about simplicity, it's to destroy the premise. Even granting the soul's simplicity, consciousness itself has always a degree which always allows of diminution. What fades isn't the substance but the remissio, the intensive quantity, the degree of reality, and This can diminish through infinitely many smaller degrees until it reaches zero. You can go out not like a candle snuffed, but like a candle burned. Mendelssohn had proved you can't be divided. Kant pointed out you can still be extinguished. What's left after the paralogisms are dismantled is a claim Kant states with genuine precision. The analysis of the consciousness of myself in thought in general yields nothing whatsoever towards the knowledge of myself as object. The logical exposition of thought in general has been mistaken for a metaphysical determination of the object. Rational psychology, the whole enterprise of inferring the soul's nature from the bare form of self-consciousness, exists not as doctrine, but only as discipline. It can't tell you what the soul is, but it can tell you what kind of pretension to stop making, which is the only thing that keeps speculative reason from tumbling into either a soulless materialism or a groundless spiritualism, both of which are errors made on the cheap. The negative result is doing real work. It clears the table so that practical reason, the moral life, can operate without being undercut by bad metaphysics. And Kant means this seriously, not as consolation. The dialectical illusion in rational psychology arises. He says, from the confusion of an idea of reason, the idea of a pure intelligence, with the completely undetermined concept of a thinking being in general. We think ourselves in thought, while abstracting from all actual experience. We then conclude that we can be conscious of our existence even apart from experience and its empirical conditions. And we slide from the possible abstraction from our empirically determined existence to the supposed consciousness of a possible separate existence of the thinking self. That slide is the whole disaster. It's not a venal error. It's the kind of mistake that looks like discovery. But here's where Kant's solution develops a problem he doesn't fully face. He wants to say the I think is a purely formal condition, the determining self, not the determinable self, the function, not the object. And that, because it's formal, it yields no knowledge of what we are. The trouble is that this very distinction between the self as formal condition and the self as possible object of inner intuition requires there to be something whose two aspects these are. Kant calls the underlying entity the transcendental subject, and then insists we can't know it, can't apply categories to it, can't say anything about its mode of existence. But the word subject is still doing enormous work in his own framework. It's not nothing, this thing that thinks. It's the necessary condition for the possibility of any experience whatsoever, which is precisely what the rational psychologist wanted to say about the soul. Kant has evacuated the content of the soul's description while leaving the structural role completely intact. The think accompanies all representations, his words, and all knowledge depends on its unity, his words. And yet we're supposed to conclude that this thing, whatever it is, lies permanently beyond knowledge, a blank at the center of every cognition. He has not dissolved the soul. He has made it permanently unknowable and permanently necessary. Permanently necessary, which is a stranger position than the one he replaced, and one that subsequent philosophy, from Fichte's absolute ego to the various phenomenological accounts of pre-reflective self-awareness, found impossible to leave alone. The rational psychologists at least thought they knew what they were talking about. After Kant, we're left with something we can neither describe nor deny, present in every thought, cognizable in none.